Let's go ahead and start with a simple statement. I've decided, in case you're wondering, the recent few weeks I've been going through what are effectively random games. And that's been very much on purpose, for two big reasons. Number one, every game that you've seen me look at, well, for a while really, but basically ever since the Star Wars thing, has been requested by a patron. Naturally, in many cases there's no real rhyme or reason to a lot of those. Obviously, I pushed the things that were most requested by multiple patrons were pushed to the top of the list. See the Metal Gear Solid series and Star Wars for good examples of that. But there were a lot of things that one patron said, I'd really like to talk you to talk about this game, Arsh. And well, that's the whole point of that request list, right? Now, to make something clear, I feel I haven't quite. I do take requests for ruminations from my patrons. However, what I do is, rather than just anybody can say whenever, hey, I want you to look at this, in order to keep things more organized, I say, okay, tell me what you want. I'll have a big post on Patreon, and people say, and I take note of that list and notate it and see how many people voted for what, and kind of make a general order for the schedule for that, which has a lot to do with how long the games are. For example, someone requested a Rumination of Kingdoms of Amalur, which is a game I've been playing since November. Yes, really. Now, granted, that's in between playing other games, shorter games, and of course lots of RL stuff, but the point is, that's a damned long game. So I'm still going through that. So I like to slot it in, so long game, short games, long game, short games, that kind of a thing, right? But the point is, I do that to be organized, so if those posts aren't, once I finish that list, once I go down through that list, which will be another 2 or 3 months, by the way, if anybody's wondering, then I'll do another post saying, okay, cleared the queue, now please ask your requests, and that. So I just wanted to get that information out there. Secondly, there is another reason why I like doing this, and it's kind of one of the things that I want to do. I don't even have a good way to explain why, but it's for variety. I like, anytime I have something that I at least feel like I have something to talk about, I want to go ahead and get those thoughts out there, maybe encourage other people to try a game they haven't tried, or to think about a game they have played in a different manner, something like that, right? And so getting that variety out there is something that's important to me. And I received a comment not too long ago, a few weeks ago by your standards, but whatever, about Far Cry 3, where someone was like, I never expected you to do a rumination on Far Cry 3. It's a common thing like that, right? And I do get comments like that every now and again. So here we are. That leads us nicely into our intro, Sonic Colors. Now I have a few things to talk about right off the bat. First and foremost, let me make this absolutely clear. This is the Wii version. 2 big reasons. 3, actually. Number 1, I own the Wii version. I have played the Wii version. I've played the Wii version multiple times. I never really had the interest or desire to play through the DS version. I played a friend of mine's copy and then put it down and never felt the urge to pick it up myself. Second reason, the Wii version was the one that was requested. And third reason, the DS version does have some differences from the Wii version, but ultimately they are not significant enough, I felt, really deserving of its own rumination. Ultimately, there's nothing I could say about the DS version that I couldn't also say about the Wii version, other than some differences in the storyline, very minute, I might add, and a little variance in gameplay, and that's it. So, moving on. I consider myself a Sonic game fan, but I am not really a big fan. I'm not someone who's like, yeah, new Sonic game, or oh, I hate Sonic. I'm not in a hate or fanboy category. I'm not a big follower of the community or of the games. But I do enjoy a fairly large amount of Sonic games. But one of the interesting things I've found over the years is that, with one other exception, the Sonic community, the fans of Sonic, are the second worst community I've ever seen. But I don't mean that in a bad way, as weird as that sounds. I'm explaining this wrong. What I mean is that the Sonic community disagrees with itself violently, often with a great deal of acidity and vitriol. They tend to spit venom at each other about their differences in opinion about Sonic games. And there's nothing really wrong with that, but they are definitely an incredibly divisive community. If anyone's curious, the worst community I've ever seen in that particular respect would actually be the Doctor Who fan base community, which at this point we might as well just call communities, but I'm not getting into that. So, why is that? Now, I could, technobabble at you, but let's really go into what I believe genuinely explains a lot of the things about the entire Sonic franchise. See, Mario Brothers came out, and it was a side-scrolling platformer with some puzzle elements. And then Mario Brothers 3 came out, and it added a variety of power-ups and greater extents as far as content, threadbare story, more characters, and of course the overworld map. Mario World came out, started fleshing out certain aspects of it more, greater emphasis on level design, and using new mechanics in order to actually make the levels themselves much more interesting and adaptive. Mario 64 came out, brought us to 3D, actually added a lot of different elements with regards to how you can move through the world, and gave Mario a great deal of that athletic feeling that he should have in a 3D environment that he already had in the 2D environment. Mario Sunshine came out and really focused on the stage elements, kind of like Mario World did to Mario 3, and basically was Mario 64 with better stages and more focus on that kind of thing. Mario Galaxy came out and added the gravity mechanic. Obviously this is a very brief look at it, but the point is the Mario franchise has always been directed. There's very little point at which the Mario fandom can have a huge and lengthy debate about what is for example, main Mario game. Most people would agree it's Mario, Lost Levels, 2, 3, World, 64, Sunshine, Galaxy 2, and then the more recent string of games, which admittedly have backslid a bit as far as innovation. And then Mario 3D World came out, was awesome. Point being, the Mario franchise has always been directed. It has direction, I should just say. And there's something where you can point to it and definitively say, this is what makes it a Mario game. There is no such thing for Sonic. Sonic 1 and Sonic 2 and Sonic and Knuckles, which I believe was Sonic 3, but I always get that confused, definitively were pretty distinct games in the sense that all three of those were, yes, you could call those Sonic games. It's basically been muddled ever since then, though. And while that is... And the thing is, I could just hear some of you guys saying, well, that's not true, because blah, blah, blah also is a Sonic game. And yet at the same time, I could hear the same argument from different people saying, well, three totally different games are main Sonic games. And that's exactly my point. What has been done is twofold. Number one, the Sonic franchise has never been under the same general management of creative staff, of actual directorial staff, anything like that. The Mario franchise has always had at least some of the same type of people working on it that worked on it before. Granted, some people have left, some people have come, but overall, the team has retained a coherency across games to the point where, on average, any given individual person has worked on at least 2 Mario games, and therefore can keep contributing to that into the future. If they leave, someone else could take over and pass the torch and so forth. The Sonic games don't really have that. That brings me to the second point. The Sonic games, from a more corporate perspective, have never really had that kind of thing, not counting the first 3 games, like I said, because the Sonic franchise as an IP has kind of bounced around a lot, thanks in no part to the fact that Sega kind of bounced around a lot after, I don't want to get too much into the corporate aspect of that, but both of these things lead us to 2 undeniable points. One, with few exceptions, most of the Sonic games have been made by a relatively different team. Even if it's sometimes under the same label or company, it's almost always a different team. And 2, each time, and I'm not sure why, they keep trying to reinvent the wheel. This is the most important point, really. This is the one I'm really leading up to. This, in my opinion, explains everything about the Sonic franchise. Because each time they reinvent the wheel, they add new concepts, new ideas, new facets to the gameplay, new facets to the storytelling, new facets to the story itself, new ways in which it's presented and executed. It is literally trying to go back to the drawing board and say, okay, now start with a blue hedgehog in the middle, now what? And just branching off from there. And that leads so naturally to that divisive community, because most people, let's say, for example, me, I like ABC. Let's say my friend Gary likes BCD. Let's say Bob over there likes D, F, and G, and he likes A and D, and he likes F and A. We like different things. We're humans. I talked about this in my Final Fantasy VIII video. I've talked about this many times since then. There's nothing wrong with that. But when you have a franchise that each game is so violently different from each other in basically every way, except for the fact that it has the word Sonic in it, you're not going to like all the games in that franchise. You're going to like the ones that have the elements you like, that are competently presented. Now, it is also worth noting that there have been some games in the Sonic franchise that are genuinely bad. Although, in my honest opinion, I can only actually point to 2 which really deserve that label. one which came out last year, and one which came out in 2006. I think you know which those two are. Nevertheless, and of course that's a divisive thing as well. I know some people who really hate the I forget the exact name, but it's the Magic Lamp one, the Genie one. I know some people who hate the Black Knight one, for example. Now, and of course some people would argue whether those are main games or side games. You get where I'm going with all this. So many people find different things and look at Sonic and say, well, this is what makes a Sonic game. F, R, and X is what makes a Sonic game. And someone else says it and says, well, no, A, X, and N is what makes a Sonic game. And how many of the... And there's so little consistency amongst the Sonic franchise that it's no wonder people like the next game and then dislike the game that comes after that. And then like the game that comes after that one. With all that said, I'm going to go ahead and lay out my opinion here. This is not a full look at everything, because I forget exactly when the adventure games came out, although I like the adventure games. I didn't care for the Magic Lamp one. I don't think I have to say my opinion on 06, since I kind of already did. But in my opinion, I started really getting back into the Sonic series with Sonic Unleashed. Now, hear me out for a moment, okay? Because this also is part of my point. I know some people are going to be looking at me like, you liked Sonic Unleashed? Really? Well, yes and no. In the interest of fairness, I only played half of Unleashed. I played the day levels of Unleashed. See, this actually worked out in a wonderful way, which is debatably cheating. My friend Gary and I, for the longest time, I remembered Sonic Unleashed as a co-op game. Now, again, you're probably looking at me like, huh? Because Gary played the nighttime levels, which he enjoyed more than the day, and I played the day, which I enjoyed more than the night. So we both got more enjoyment from it than we would have if we'd been playing through the whole game by ourselves. Weird situation, huh? We liked it so much, we actually 100%ed that game. Got all the rings, got all the S rankings. So I actually have very fond memories of Unleashed. But it is worth noting that it's only because I played the aspect of the game that appealed to me. So it doesn't really count, and I have to admit that in the interest of fairness. Now, I also liked Black Knight. Black Knight, or Dark Knight, or Camelot Knight, or whatever it was actually called, I don't even remember. I own the game, and I can't remember the name of it, is what I call a once-off. Popcorn game. I played through it once. It was interesting. The story was competently presented, if not very fascinating in its own right. The gameplay was fun. I liked the battle sequences, and then I put it down, and I have no real intention of playing it again. Sonic Generations I have not completed. I do intend to. It's actually on the Rumination request, so I will be completing Sonic Generations. If for no other reason than that, but of course because I want to. But I haven't beaten it yet, so I can't really comment it other than I've really been enjoying it so far. So there's that. And the 3D one on the Wii U, again, I have not completed. In fact, I do not own. I played a friend's copy and the demo. But in both cases, I really liked what I played and do intend to buy it and play through it sometime. I think that's all of the modern Sonics, except for the one I'm talking about right now. Some of you may not be aware of this, but back when the whole Mass Effect thing happened, 3 years ago, 4 years ago, I don't remember how long it's been. After a while, I was requested of me to sit down and do real, what at the time I called reviews. Really, it was a misnomer. My ruminations, before I called them that, of Mass Effect 1, Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect 3, one right after the other. And they're still some of my most watched videos to this day. But when I did that, I was really tempted to censor myself. And I realized at the time, even though it wasn't like, I wasn't that big yet back then, it wasn't actually my job, it wasn't what I was doing full time, but I realized that I was at a career branch, basically, because if I censored myself, what I'd be doing is creating a persona that I would then be portraying for you guys. Instead, I made the decision to be myself. To be me. I've talked about this several times. What you see here is me. I'm actually very extroverted. I talk a lot. I'm not good at communicating. I stutter. All that fun stuff. I'm not reading off a script. I've got nothing. My monitor's off. And, this is my notes, right? So this is just very open and very honestly me. And I don't censor my opinions with you guys. However, I bring this up because every now and again I kind of wince at that because I'm about to say something that's probably going to be controversial, and I imagine I'm going to get blasted for it, but whatever. In my opinion, Sonic Colors is the best Sonic game thus far. Keeping in mind I haven't finished Generations. It's also worth noting I haven't played through Sonic Boom yet, so it's very possible that that might actually be the best Sonic game to date. You never know, right? Where to start with colors? Now that we're finally talking about the game. Excuse me, I'm very dry today. Colors, okay. One of the things I didn't like about Unleashed was that you were on rails during the day section. Now, I know you're probably looking at me weird, so let me try and explain what I mean by that. Obviously, you're on rails. It's a side-scrolling platformer. You've basically got one way to go with the occasional branch and thing. That's not what I mean. What I mean is the method by which you were allowed to play the game was very, very tightly defined. There were only two types of playing Unleashed during the day modes. You either were dead stopped, either because you put the controller down or because you died, or you were going full tilt. Now, I like going full tilt. That was enjoyable. But the thing is, the levels were literally designed in a way to force you to go full tilt. To put you on rails, to literally restrict you at going top speed all the time. And yet the weird thing is, if you think about it, that's not how the original Sonic games were. I dare just about any of you out there who actually enjoy the Sonic series to go back and play Sonic 1 or, and this is a better example, Sonic 2 on the Genesis sometime. Because I bet you remember those games, at least if you really played them a lot and got good at them, like admittedly I did. You remember them as a blur, you know, bounce, right? That's how you remember them. But if you pick them up right now, having not played them for years, you'd probably have the same experience I did. And in fact, I did this just to make my point clear. Or rather, to see if I was right or not. And it was true. I go through and I'm like, okay. There we go. I did this, jump. And it was much slower than I remembered because I didn't remember the levels. Because I didn't know where the jumps were and what to hit when. And I didn't have that flow going. I didn't have the momentum going. So the interesting thing, though, was Sonic 1, probably unintentionally based on the design and layout of the levels, was built in a way so that you were encouraged to go fast, but not forced to. Sonic 2 was absolutely designed with this in mind. Encouraged momentum. It was a unique way of encouraged replayability because as you replayed the level, you got to know it better. And as you got to know it better, you could go through it faster, which was then more enjoyable, thereby leaning itself to that particular niche market of speedy platformer. Which, honestly, there weren't really many. Hell, even to this day, there aren't many games you could call a speedy platformer. And so when I was playing Sonic Colors, I found myself in the exact same thing. Not just when I was replaying it for this Rumination, but when I first picked it up, when it first came out, it was like, jump, jump. And I'm like, no, I just want to go. I don't want to go. Because it wasn't that long after I'd played Unleashed. But as I started going through it, I started realizing that, okay, well, this is here and this is there. So I immediately replayed the first level again and went through it much faster. And then I replayed it again and blazed through it, because by this point I knew exactly where I was going. Sonic Colors does exactly what Sonic 2 did so well. It encourages that momentum. And then it does two other kind of cool things. Admittedly, not the first one to do this, but the red rings and the rankings both exist to encourage you to replay the levels. Not force you to, because they're not really required for anything. But they encourage you to. It's like, well, if you do better, you might get a better ranking. If you do better, you might get those extra rings. And if you do, you get to know the level better, which means you get to go through it faster. You see where this works? It's a brilliantly subtle form of level design that, again, I feel like the series hasn't really mastered since, well, actually Sonic and Knuckles did a pretty good job of the two, but debatably Sonic 2 is really the one I remember most for that one. Now, another thing they tended to do was they added a lot of little details that I feel like were really trying to reach out to fans of Sonic 2. And I'm going to keep mentioning Sonic 2 specifically here, so forgive me. For example, the number of references in this game is monumental. There are references everywhere to previous Sonic games in general, but most especially to the old ones. And another thing they do, I actually thought about making a list of them, and I decided no. Feel free to look it up online. There's some, I'm sure. But there's a lot of convenience features in the way that, for example, you can actually turn on or off the ability to see when pits are coming, or what's a bottomless pit and what isn't, or when you have to duck, or when you have to slide, that kind of a thing. Not necessarily to treat you like you're an idiot, but because it's optional, it helps you the first time through, or the second time through, to get used to it, to get that flow, that momentum thing going. Another thing, and I know this sounds weird, but the very first stage, if you're not aware of this, if you pull it in Sonic Colors and you hit the start button, the first thing you do is you play the first stage. That may or may not sound weird, but that hasn't been true since like the Genesis era. You hit start and you play the stage, and then the opening cutscene plays after you beat the first stage, which is skippable, by the way, which is another convenience feature. And another thing is that this game, unlike so many of the other Sonic games, honestly, I feel like this is the Sonic game that has tried the least to reinvent the wheel. Pure speed sections, lots of speed platforming, lots of fun stuff you can do with it, adding the power-ups which make it... And the power-ups, this is another wonderful way of that. You're encouraged to go fast but not required, because you get a power-up and you want to use it now and go! But you don't have to. You can take your time, and listen, and it's so subtle. The sound, the music actually changes to be this really high-paced go, 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 go thing. But you don't actually have to go. You can just sit there and be like, okay, I'll just take my time and line this up and go. Okay, now I'm ready. Figure out the exact angle for the laser beam. Figure out exactly where I want to go with the frenzy, etc. You can take your time with it if you feel like it. You don't have to. You can go as fast as you want. And that as fast as you want part is, again, what I'm emphasizing here. It's all optional. I have to pause for a moment to give some real credit to the music. Now, granted, I've actually liked Sonic music for some time. In fact, I've often famously said that one of the only good things to come out of Sonic 06 was the soundtrack, because there was some really good music in there. But I really like the music in Sonic Colors. I have several of the songs on my 02 and 01 playlists. Not the 00, not 0, but still high praise. And I have to give an amazing amount of credits and praise to the people who did the graphics for this game. The backgrounds as you're going through the stages are like concentrated joy that you're running through. I mean, I know it sounds like I'm overstating this, but I don't know how to overstate this. This game is gorgeous, especially for a Wii game. And the amount of time and effort and detail that was obviously put into making massive, huge areas with tons of stuff to look at, and tons of detail and tons of colors, and it's all their effect, and they did that as a loading screen. I've often said that you can tell a good developer by one of two things. One, and it really boils down to the same concept, that they care. When they put in the detail that isn't mandatory, when they put in the time and attention into something that you're probably not even going to notice, usually that's a sign of a good developer. They could have just put in loading screens, like previous games have done. Excuse me. They could have just put in like a segue section where it's just like, and then you're in the new area. But instead they have these sweeping sections of, here's just some awesome stuff to look at for like 20 seconds while we load the next area. Because they could. Because they wanted to try that extra mile. All of this, now you notice I'm basically talking about just the gameplay here. I don't have much to say about the story, but I'm going to pause before we get to the story because I want to finish all my thoughts about the gameplay here. And those thoughts are, in my opinion, Sonic Colors is a proper example of a Type 1 sequel. Now, to explain what I mean really quick, for those of you who haven't followed me before or heard me talk about this, in my professional opinion, there are two types of sequels that really tend to work. Sequel type number one is this. Another good example to explain by example is StarCraft and StarCraft 2. It is the first game, but more and better. It is effectively a form of expansion, just touched up and sufficient added to it to make it its own thing, right? For those of you who are curious, a Type 2 sequel is something more along the lines of Portal 2 to Portal, where they take it and run in a different direction with it than the original. There's a lot of other examples of that. I don't want to get into that too much. Final Fantasy II to Final Fantasy I is actually a pretty good example, oddly enough. I'm getting off track. So, this is a really good example of a Type 1 sequel, which leads me to an odd thought. While there have been a lot of good Sonic games since Sonic 2, wouldn't it have been a weird world if they made Sonic, and it was good, and they made Sonic 2, and it was great, and then we got nothing for years until, say, about 2006 came around, and then Sonic Colors came out of nowhere. What if this was our third Sonic game, instead of our, 10th or whatever it was? How different would we view the Sonic franchise if that were true? How different would the fan base be? I'm not saying that it would necessarily be better or worse. I just find the concept fascinating because, as you remember, we got Sonic 06 in '06, and it was garbage. I know people who can enjoy Sonic 06 in a so bad it's good, but I've literally never heard anyone actually say that it is in any way a good game. It's just a game they enjoy because it's bad. You know, even people who enjoy the game acknowledge it's bad, right? So, at least from my experience, I don't want to speak for everyone, of course. And then, of course, we had a lot of other divisive games. Some people really didn't like the Sonic Adventure series. Some people really didn't like Shadow the Hedgehog, which you'll notice I didn't even mention earlier because I didn't even want to get into that. Admittedly, there's some things I could talk about there. The Choose Your Own Adventure retroactive timeline presentation, which also at the same time kind of takes away from any of the impetus of the storyline, while at the same time trying to be darker and edgier in Sonic. Although, speaking of dark and edgier, that's a good segue into my next point. Sonic Colors does have a story, but it is ultimately very lighthearted. And I think that's another thing that really distinguishes it from its most recent things. Previous to this, we had Black Knight, Unleashed, Shadow the Hedgehog, '06, and the Genie one I can never remember the name of, and of course the adventure games. But anyways, all of those games had actually relatively serious plots. Some of them almost parodies of serious plots, but overall the intent was definitely a darker tone in those games. And a lot of those games are very divisive amongst the fan base. And yet, as I mentioned earlier, Sonic Colors was clearly designed to be a game that fans of the original Sonic games on the Genesis, the first three, really would like. And you'll notice the tone and color and overall approach to the story is much more lighthearted and much more cartoony and generally less end-of-the-world doomy, even though it technically involves some really horrible things if you think about it, such as, mass enslavement of an entire race, and the possibility of destruction of the entire planet if things went wrong, and of course the mind control ray, blah blah blah. But even in those elements, like the mind control ray, now that's a horrible thought when you really think about it, and yet the mind control ray is undone by a piece of debris in a slapstick moment. That, I think, really shows where they were going with this story. It's like, it literally feels like the story's just about to get really dark and serious, and then, and then it switches right back to its original tone. Just before the last fight, Robotnik is doing his best to try and ham it up by giving carnival puns, you know? And then he finally is like, okay, fine, I will destroy you, is that better? That's the tone of this game. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that's better or worse, but it is definitely a deliberate choice on behalf of the creators. That being said, this game also did... I'm not saying this is a perfect game, even though I call it my favorite Sonic game. Notably, I really found myself disliking Sonic himself throughout the course of this game. And yet, at the same time, I found myself laughing at this game a lot. At Robotnik, specifically. A lot of his random quips in the background and his little snarks and over the PA system are awesome. If you can find a list of some of those, there's some real gems in there, and I strongly recommend you pick it up, because it's pretty funny. One of the other interesting things, though, about this story is it's very... It's a good example of symmetrical storytelling, which is one of those things I don't really know how to explain properly. The idea is a story does this, right? It forms symmetry from the beginning to end. A lot of stories try for this by having bookends, but bookends by themselves won't do it. Each aspect has to mirror the individual. And so the story starts off, and they're ascending the thing, and they find out about this, and it's the planet, yay, and oh my gosh, and then there's this weird thing. It's hard to explain, but basically, if you look at this game story-wise, pretty much everything up to the discovery of the mind control ray, and then from that all the way to the last boss and ending, is in its own way a mirror of the previous events that happened relative to their point of the game time, in terms of theme and in terms of tone. And it's surprisingly well constructed, is basically what I'm trying to say. Now, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about, other than my last 2 points. I do have one little note here I'm going to go ahead and mention. This is a very simple story. It's not very complex, even though it's well executed, well presented, as I just mentioned. It's not a very complex storyline. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Now, I'm not going to give judgment on that. I like simple stories if they're done well. Obviously, I like this game. But it is an interesting note because one of the things that the several previous Sonic games have done, in addition to being darker and serious and whatnot, is they've tried for a lot more complex storytelling, and it's debatable as to whether or not it has succeeded or not. Admittedly, Sonic 06 is actually a really good example of a game that was trying for a complex story and failed miserably, in my opinion. But even ignoring that, Shadow the Hedgehog was trying for a more complex storyline. The Black Knight was actually trying for a more complex thing in its approach of themes and its overall pseudo-mythical arc thing that it was going for. Whereas in this one, it's Robotnik's back! He's enslaving these people! Save them! Okay, and that's pretty basically the story, right? So, okay, two more things I'm going to talk about here. And then I'm done. This is probably going to be a short video. I have no idea how long this is, as ever. What can I say? It's a Sonic game. There's not many Sonic games I could talk that long about. Actually, this is probably the Sonic game I could talk longest about. Although I want to mention one thing real quick before I go into this. A good sign for me of a game that I really enjoy, that really clicks with me, with the way my brain chemistry works, I've talked about that concept before, is a game that I actually look forward to replaying. I can play a game and enjoy it, but a game that I know really Tetris blocks with the way my brain works is a game that I actively desire to play again, that I'm looking forward to the next time I get to. And Sonic Colors is like that for me. The power-ups, the callbacks to the old game style, the encouraged momentum without putting you on rails, the lighthearted story, admittedly, and the humorous dialogue with Robotnik, and the overall presentation of the gorgeous background and the music of it really just kind of makes that perfect little 4-block straight-line piece for me. I don't know, I just felt like commenting on that. Let's talk about the Wisps. Now, the Wisps are interesting because the Wisps, for a bit of explanation for anybody who hasn't played this game, are a species that naturally contains and can exude a power, which I don't even remember what they call it. It's like energy go on or something like that. But anyways, they are a natural energy source, a lot of energy. They can put forth a ridiculous amount of power, right? Now, a couple interesting thoughts about this. First of all, they tend to manifest in different ways, which leads to the different power-ups that Sonic can use throughout the game. And yet one of the things I got the very distinct impression of is that these power-ups, these different forms of Wisps, are not literally different species or different tribes or clans or anything like that, but rather are a more philosophical variance. Now, I'd like to pause for a moment and say that I am definitely reading too much into this, but at the same time, this is something that genuinely occurred to me when I was playing through this, so you're just getting my honest thoughts here, now that we've moved out on that. I sincerely doubt the developers thought this much about this, but the idea is there that these creatures are basically amorphous energy-being blobs, which barely have a physical presence at all. They do have a physical presence. They can be physically restrained. They are limited to their bodies in many of the same ways that we are. However, they can morph those bodies, they can change them, they are naturally malleable. We see this in the course of the game. So I always got the strong impression that what differentiates a rocket wisp from a white wisp from a blue wisp or whatever is that their personality was such that the natural energy within them expressed itself differently, and therefore they themselves express themselves differently. This is further emphasized by the fact that each of the different wisps tend to have a different, for lack of a better word, personality to them, a different way they present themselves, more aggressive, more lighthearted and chipper or energetic or whatever. And so it kind of makes sense that they would manifest differently than others of their than other wisps of a different variety, which also kind of leads to the weird thought that the basic white wisps might literally just be either wisps that have no strong opinion or personality of their own, or are young wisps, which would actually make the most sense to me, given I suddenly can't think of his name, the wisp you talk with throughout the course of the game, who is a white wisp and acts very much like a child around you, which also kind of fits in with the theme of what the Sonic games have always done by having a young person be your guest character for the given game, which usually has some kind of big secret. In this case, the big secret being that he's a wisp. Again, different storytelling approach, but the formula stays the same there. And again, this is probably me reading too much into this, but I just thought that was interesting. The other thing I find interesting, though, is the Wisps themselves seem to be a unique culture. I would normally call what the Wisps are a post-scarcity society, but that implies that there was ever a point at which they were a scarcity society. Now, I'm probably using terms not all of my viewers understand, so let me go over this without trying to go too much into theoretical economic projections here. We, in real life, live in a scarcity society. All of us. Everyone in the entire world does. What that means is we do not have infinite of everything. Now, I know what you're saying. Duh. And yet it is a theoretical possibility that given enough innovation and advancement with certain types of technologies, we could reach a point where we effectively get into a post-scarcity society. All of our economy, and debatably all of our civilization, is run by the fact that we don't have enough of everything for everyone. And so this is in light demand, but this is in heavy demand, but this is in light supply, but this is in heavy supply, etc., guides arguably everything about our societies across the whole planet. If all of that were to go away, well, we'd have Star Trek, wouldn't we? I mean, if you think about it, we'd have Earth in Star Trek, a post-scarcity society. They have infinite resources, and their entire society changed as a result of that. Now, I know that's not entirely true as, of course, of Star Trek as a whole, but again, Star Trek as a whole is not a paradise. Star Trek as a whole is not a new culture or ideal. The Federation as a whole, Starfleet as a whole are different things. But Earth, specifically, is described many times as paradise, and with good reason, and I would agree with that statement. And Earth, just Earth, is without question a post-scarcity society. And I mention this because, well, a lot of people point to that as sort of a communist, socialist sort of thing. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think it's more a case of every single building block of what makes up social interactions being fundamentally altered by the fact that I don't need anymore. My needs are met. My wants are met. And so are yours. And so's his, and so's hers. You see? And so you can see how that would fundamentally alter the entire fabric of a social structure, right? As it did in Star Trek. So the Wisps, though, always really struck me as that kind of thing because they have a whole planet of Wisps. They have a whole functioning society and friends and family units and all that fun thing, and yet they have no technology. Why would they? They have no need and no want, because the energy they naturally generate amongst themselves is all they've ever needed. They didn't need to evolve. They didn't need to mutate. They didn't need to technologically innovate like we did, or many other fictional creatures did. They just existed in this post-scarcity society as they were, without any drive or purpose to move forward, just enjoying life. And we do know they do have a society. They are not degenerate. They are not stagnant. They have friendships. They have social structures. They have communication, as sophisticated communication as we have. They have concepts and ideas to understand complex values and other things like that. And they understand that, the concept of being imprisoned is bad and all that kind of stuff. These are functionally sentient, sapient beings. They just have a culture that never needed, and therefore it evolved in a completely different manner than everyone else's. The first predator that ever came along to threaten the Wisps was Robotnik, which I'll talk about why he, of all beings, was a threat to them in my next and last point about this. I just find the whole concept of a culture like that so fascinating. It's one of the reasons the Wisps actually made their way into the Imperium as a whole, because the very concept of that kind of culture just struck me as something you could do so much with, storytelling-wise, that I couldn't resist including them in the Imperium, even though it felt kind of like cheating. Because, for those of you who don't know, in the modern era, I don't like adding more fanficky stuff to the Imperium. I try to stick to unique stuff, but it was just such a fascinating idea. I had to do something with it. And that leads me nicely into Robotnik. Robotnik is probably, in this game specifically, is probably the best example of the one-man empire I've ever seen. Let me explain what I mean by that. This is a thing I feel is underused and underrepresented in fiction, the one-man empire. The idea is there's one person, but that one person has an entire swell of resources and workers and fighters and infrastructure and all the things you would otherwise have in a society, or in a civilization, but no society, because there's no one in that society, just the one person. Now I say one man, I'm not trying to be gender specific here. It could be female, it could be it, doesn't matter. I do say man in this case, because obviously Robotnik is male, but also because there's another example of the one-man empire in video gaming. Dr. Wily. Anybody who's been reading through my Robot War theories, or rather, I guess I should say listening through my Robot War audiobooks, has known that that's one of the concepts that's been at the founding principle of Dr. Wiley. He is a single individual whose sanity continues to get worse and worse because he has no interaction with other actual living sapient beings, just his own minions. And yet he controls a sufficient force in terms of manpower, resources, economic fight might, military might, technological advancement, that he could literally sweep the planet and the various outlying colonies for that already exist as of Mega Man 1. And he's one man, just one person, nothing else. This is an idea that interests me so much that it actually was one of the reasons why I decided to write the Robot War to begin with, and also led to me adding a whole story arc in the Imperium effectively based on the concept. If you'll forgive me for talking for a moment. The entire idea was one person built a device that could construct... Okay, let me rewind a bit. This gentleman... Total Annihilation is debatably another example of the one-man empire, although that's much more debatable in that case. It is at least a society in which that could exist. Moving along. This one guy, it was a guy, I don't even remember his name. In fact, I think I deliberately decided not to write his name because he has forgotten his name. Spent days, weeks, months, and years slaving over creating a single robotic unit. One robot, right? And after those years, he created it, and it was a worker, okay? This worker was designed to build other workers. It had all the knowledge of its own creation in itself. So it could build those other workers. All it needed was resources. It could also be programmed with any other designs he came up with. And this man was brilliant. So he went ahead and immediately went to work on his next work, which was he wanted to make something that could gather resources to build this, because he had spent all his life savings and all of his time and effort, literally in some cases scavenging and stealing, in order to get what he needed in order to create this robot. The second time around, it got a little bit easier, but not much. Still took several years in order to go ahead and get access to what he needed to make the second robot. But then he had two, and now he used those two to get more resources to get more, and you can kind of see how this gets exponential. And he kept going with this, and kept going with this. And this one person, within the space of about a decade, had a literal army of robotic units and entire cities of just metal, and his own robotic servants that were all at his beck and call. Now, you might be imagining where the story is going, but this man, by contrast, had no aims, no goals. He was doing what he wanted to do. This was actually his retirement. He had retired, and this was his big thing. He wanted to create this robotic society because it was what he wanted to do. I mean, that's the end of it. There were no big ambitions. There was no, I will conquer the world. That was all he wanted, was to do this. And so he just kind of kept going and going until it reached the point where an entire system and everything in that system was under his control. And he was the only person in that whole system, because none of his robots were actually sapient or sentient. They were simply functional. And I loved the idea of what you could do with that. One of the first stories I wrote about that gentleman was him accidentally, basically, encountering another spacefaring species, another small-scale one, system-wide, basically. And they happened to reach his system, and they found his robots, and like, oh my god, there's life here. Because robots means someone built those robots, right? And so they tried to communicate with the robots, which were not programmed to deal with that. And I'm going to fast forward a bit. It led to war. Because when they finally actually encountered him, he had been spending the last 30 years not talking to anyone, not interacting with anyone, literally kind of degenerating, but not into an animal. He didn't become some kind of feral creature. He just kind of formed his own self-reaffirming, degenerate personality, basically, because the only one he had to bounce his own thoughts off of was himself. I've talked about this idea before, the idea of social consensus, and the way that we humans grow and learn and think by being social, by bouncing ideas and thoughts and otherwise interacting with other people. When you take that away, weird things can happen. And that was the case with this gentleman, the mystery man, the one-man empire, which is the name of the story, by the way. And when he finally got in contact with the aliens, he didn't even really know how to properly speak anymore. I don't mean he lost English, or Common, actually. He could still speak Common. He knew the language, but his sentence structure was wrong. And he had no social graces, no niceties to him. And in fact, he was so accustomed to everyone listening to everything he had to say ultimately and perfectly, that when he, who was very excited to actually see someone else as a sapient being, he was like, yes, you must come down here immediately and we'll talk and everything. The way he said it was as a threat, as a demand. And it ended up kind of badly when they tried to run, and he tried to force them to stay, and you get why that led to war. And that war is actually what drew the Empire's attention to this whole situation. And they had to lead people in here and basically extract this one guy and be like, look, you're kind of a problem. And yet even then it wasn't something that was easy to deal with, because as long as he was by himself and not causing interstellar war, he wasn't actually hurting anybody. And in fact, he was actually quite happy with his life there overall. I mean, he liked the idea of other companionship, but he had what he wanted, really. He had what he'd always wanted his whole life. He had done it. He had retired. He had his own massive mechanical empire, and he just kind of kept building and kept innovating. They weren't even stagnant militarily, economically, or not technologically, excuse me, militarily and technologically, because he kept coming up with new ideas, because that's what he wanted to do. It was actually comforting to him to go ahead and keep inventing. Forgive me for digressing so far, but I wanted to do so to really stress how interesting I've always found Robotnik in basically the same exact reason. And again, nowhere is that more on display than in this game. Robotnik, in this game, pulls off technological feats that would probably make the Borg drool with envy and just start putting their napkins up and charging in there, because, oh my god, he manages to link planets together and create what is effectively an interstellar amusement park on a scale almost unheard of. This is effectively I forget the term, but it's a superstructure. It is a superstructure thing. And he does this as a cover story for what he's really after, which is a mind control ray. And I want to stress that a mind control ray is certainly not an unimpressive feat, but compared to what he did as the cover story, it's pathetically small. But that just goes across all the more how impressive it is what he's accomplished. He has built this huge planetary system-sized construction by himself. Which again brings me back to that point. Robotnik has no one else. Now granted, he has his robot servants that actually talk with him, and Sonic Colors is not interested in examining what that does to human psyche, like I was in the One Man Empire storyline, but nevertheless, the concept was so fascinating that that's one of the things that actually stuck with me most about this game, story-wise, was the idea that one man could accomplish all this. If I can digress for just another moment, this is another thing I've always found fascinating about the second Lich King over in Warcraft. Debatably, although there are some exceptions, the second Lich King was the only actual sapient sentient being in that, because all the individual souls were all the ones that were the wrong versions, like Death Knight Arthas, not real Arthas. If you don't know what I'm talking about, don't stress, but if you do, you know what I mean. He was the only one who was basically himself amongst a huge mass of people who were effectively just mind slaves. And yet he accomplished incredible feats basically by himself. Same kind of concept there. Fascinating stuff. Anyways, I guess that's all I've got. I hope that you have enjoyed me talking about a Sonic game. I'll see you at the next one.